I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Lauren, and I started at Empoword as admin editor, but I've recently been promoted to one of the social media managers, which is very exciting. And alongside this, I've kind of been working with a group of ladies to do the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion workshop series, which we're obviously a part of. And I'm also joined by Shannon. She's going to take over.
So I'm Shannon. I'm one of the editor-in-chiefs at Empoword. I'm also training at Cardiff currently and done a bit of freelance journalism. And yeah, just really excited to be part of the workshop series, and a big thank you to Lauren for organising all these and really being the backbone behind the series. It's been great to see and it's really exciting. And thank you to Sophie for coming along, which is going to be exciting to learn off somebody who's been quite a figurehead in the queer journalism community, in my opinion.
Yes, thank you. I'm very excited to be here. I should hold off on introducing myself till you guys want to start the sort of question format.
All I was going to say is that obviously we're joined by a very special guest, and we're going to be discussing lots of different topics, including Sophie's founding of the LGBTQ+ journalism network, kind of her first-hand experiences in the industry, and her time as a freelancer. So yeah, go for it, Sophie.
Okay, so I'll sort of start off just introducing myself generally. So I'm Sophie. I studied at Bryant University. I did theatre and English, and then I did a master's degree at King's College London in contemporary literature, culture and theory. So even though I did quite a word-heavy set of degrees, and I was very involved in student journalism all throughout, I never really thought, oh, I could be a journalist. I just always thought I wanted to work with words. So when I graduated, started applying for jobs in anything related to words, so communications, PR, marketing, anything like that, copywriting. And then the pandemic started and all the jobs dried up. And it's at that point I realised I wanted to be a journalist. And that's actually what I was really interested in doing. So I managed to get a remote placement with Diva magazine, which of course is a leading lesbian and bisexual women's magazine. And that really definitely sparked my interest in journalism and being a writer. But of course, we were in the middle of the pandemic. We couldn't go anywhere, couldn't do anything. There was no jobs. So I decided to do my NCTJ studies. I received Journalism Diversity funding to do that. So I spent a year doing my NCTJ. And luckily from the training that I got doing my NCTJ, the connections I made, the work experience I undertook, I managed to score a job at the Oxford Mail before I finished my studies. So I started at the Oxford Mail in July 2021, and I'm just about to leave actually and start a new job with Pink News in January, covering LGBTQ related journalism, which of course is obviously my specialist area and something I've always wanted to do. So it's a bit of a dream job, and I'm very excited to start, and obviously very excited to be here today to talk about that very niche area that I love.
Yeah, no, congratulations again. It was such good timing as well. I saw it come on the Instagram and I was like, oh, we'll have to talk a bit about that. But yeah, we kind of started the other workshop off by discussing diversity because it underpins the whole series. So the first question is quite a big one. I just wanted to know, do you think the industry is doing enough to support and celebrate those within the LGBTQ community and creating a space for them within journalism? I know you said you wrote for Diva and now you're at Pink News, which kind of reflect a specific culture or space being curated for members of the community. I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a massive topic. It's certainly something that we can't cover in even just the whole hour. It's a huge issue, diversity in journalism, and I'm going to drop a link into the chat for anyone that is interested. So it's the NCTJ's most recent diversity in journalism report, and it's really interesting reading, something that anyone who is interested in diversity or is in a management position in journalism should pay attention to. Obviously, it covers a lot of characteristic areas, so religion, race, class. However, one issue is it doesn't cover sexuality or gender identity. It has sex, but not gender identity. And the reason for this, I have spoken to the NCTJ about including those characteristics, but they draw their data from the labour force survey, which the government carries out. but they've spoken to the government about including those characteristics. So it's one of those that they're still trying to include LGBT as you know, an umbrella characteristic, but at the moment it's not included. So there's this difficulty in the sense that while other characteristics you can see the statistics in relation to journalism, like for example with class, shockingly or unshockingly, however you want to see it, 80% of journalists still come from the top 3 occupation bands, and only 2% come from the lowest occupation bands. So journalism remains a very middle class, very upper class industry. You know, there's not a lot of working class people, and that's something that really needs to be addressed, because that is such a different, the figures compared to the rest of the labour force are so different in journalism in that sense. So it obviously matters a lot what these numbers show, and the fact that people's sexuality and gender identity are not being included, it's then difficult to say, oh, well, we know what the numbers are, what the, you know, the statistics in relation to progression are, or, you know, we can say, oh, well, cis gay men, perhaps, for example, are doing much better than trans people in terms of rising up the ranks in journalism. Of course, we don't know that. It might be the other way around, but we don't have the statistics to back it up. So we can't address issues without having the statistics. So a big thing is that I say that journalists, LGBT journalists, need to be counted in order to make this change, which of course is the reason that we have these diversity reports, diversity surveys, independent publications will carry out this, the NCTJ carries out their survey, which is all really important, but we need LGBT people to be counted in these surveys. Obviously, we've got the new data for the census due to come out in January in relation to sexuality and gender identity. That's the first time that any census has counted those characteristics. So the NCTJ said to me they are going to look at the census data to see if there's anything they can pull from that to kind of use that in their diversity report. But again, it's very dependent on what questions the government has asked. So it's certainly a big issue, and it's something that, you know, needs to be continually looked at and addressed, because while we're seeing changes in certain areas, for example, in terms of the sex characteristic, the equality between the sexes in terms of junior and senior levels is really becoming quite equal. But then we have this you know, difference with race is another issue where while there's movement in terms of on the lower levels of journalism becoming more equal, there's still only a very small proportion of people who are from non-white backgrounds who are editors and senior leaders. So there's obviously issues in that part, and so that's why this data is very important. And again, as I say, it's a huge topic, huge issue. You can literally write an entire dissertation on it and still not get to the answer. So yeah, it's certainly one that this series of workshops, it's really good. It's touching on it in different ways, touching on different areas, but in terms of LGBT representation, we need to be counted in order to know what the issues are, and that's the main thing, I think, really, with it.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting point that, like, you know, LGBTQ journalists aren't really counted. A kind of moving off from that really interesting kind of like in-depth statistical and, you know, brief that you gave us, I think often in journalism we forget that we're serving audiences. So kind of like, you know, how do you feel that the lack of inclusion, because obviously we're not even being seen in statistics, how do you feel that the lack of inclusion perhaps is, you know, is that affecting, you know, queer media consumers? And like, why is inclusion and diversity like important within, you know, journalisms, whether it's in the newsroom or, you know, our audiences as well?
Yeah, I mean, so as journalists, we're there to tell stories. We're there to tell stories, whoever our audience is. You know, if you work for a football publication, you're there to serve people who are interested in football. If you work for a local paper like I do currently, you're there to serve that local community. If you work for a queer publication, you're there to serve the queer community. So in terms of reporters representing those communities, if you're in touch with a community, you can obviously tell those stories better, which is why I say that LGBTQ+ stories are really important in local news, because everywhere in this country has a queer community, be it like a tiny little village hall meeting that happens once every 3 months in like the Scottish borders, or, you know, a massive club scene, underground punk club scene or something in London. There's a scene somewhere and people will have a very small community, or have any sort of community. So if you're working on Patch and you want to tell those stories, if you are connected with that community, you're going to do that more authentically because you're going to understand it, which is exactly why, like, for example, if someone is part of the Afro-Caribbean community, they're going to be able to tell the stories affecting people in those communities, in cities and towns, across the country, better than me, a white person who doesn't have a direct connection with that community, hasn't grown up in that environment, and perhaps understand why a Caribbean cafe that might close down really means something, because maybe I didn't grow up going there with my family and that sort of thing. And that's why it matters. That's why we are there to tell stories from all stripes. You don't have to be LGBT to tell an LGBT story. You don't have to be of a certain background, because as journalists, we should be able to, impartially tell stories. But it certainly helps if you have that experience and connection. So speaking entirely personally here, in terms of the topic of LGBTQ plus stories, my time at the Oxford Mail, I've forged some really close good connections with sources from Oxford Pride, Bicester Pride, the LGBT venues in the city, and they know to come to me, trust me to tell those stories authentically in a way that they might not trust my colleagues. So much so that once when I was on holiday a couple of months ago, my colleague rung up Oxford Pride to ask them a question about something, can't remember what it was, and they were like, but why are you ringing us? Why isn't Sophie ringing us? And they just had to say, sorry, she's on holiday. But it was that automatic thing of they just used to me being the sort of go-to person, because they just know that I understand the community. So I think this is why in newsrooms it's very important for there to be diversity, there to be inclusion, because it means that stories are being told more authentically. You're going to understand the language to use, the way in which to approach a story, that sort of thing. And that's why, traditionally newsrooms that have been white, male-led, middle class often miss a lot of really important stories because they're just not in tune with those communities. We take the cost of living crisis. If the entire newsroom has grown up in a very comfortable middle class background, their parents went to university, they've never had to worry about money, how on earth can they understand what people going through at the moment? People who are literally having to choose between heating and eating, to use that phrase, people who are using food banks, who might have full-time jobs, but they just cannot make ends meet and are having to go to food banks because the cost of bills is just so expensive. How are they going to understand that and know how to tell those stories and address those concerns? And that's why it's really important to have inclusion in newsrooms, to have diverse voices, because it just means that the authenticity is there. And of course, it just makes the storytelling better if you've had that lived experience. So that's a very long way of just saying that inclusion is, of course, very important for telling stories.
No, that is so great, because it definitely is, like you said, obviously being from the community, kind of like having people from diverse communities makes storytelling better. It creates a horizontal form of journalism that makes people want to engage, and obviously when people see themselves in the news, they engage with it more. Kind of moving on to a similar topic as well, obviously the acceptance of perhaps LGBTQ coverage has gotten slightly better, obviously, since I think it's important to note the World AIDS Day was yesterday, and during that time was a really difficult time for the queer community. But not only that, the representation in the media of the community was awful. So it's obviously progressed since then, but it's obviously a work in progress. I wouldn't say it's perfect. But for you as an LGBTQ journalist, kind of like, I was wondering if you've personally ever encountered any obstacles along your journey. I know you've worked in very predominantly LGBTQ circles in terms of writing for Diva, and now you're going into Pink News, but you've also worked in newsrooms that are perhaps more not, I don't want to say traditional journalism, but perhaps could have been more cis het majority newsrooms, and kind of what was that like for you as an LGBTQ individual?
Yeah, especially, just popping in as well, because you said about your intersection of being a member of the LGBTQ and being working class. I feel like I just wanted to mention that as well. Might be changed things, or
Yeah, I mean, so I've been very lucky in the sense that so a lot of the freelance work I've done, so you mentioned I have wrote for Diva, I've also got bylines on Gay Times and Queer AF and some other LGBT aligned publications, and it's obviously something I'm very passionate about. But I'm very lucky in the sense that the Oxford Mail, which is where I've spent, you know, my first 18 months as a proper working journalist, it is a very open and inclusive kind of environment. They're very happy for people to explore stories that matter to them, and they know that if I've got that connection with the community, then I'm going to be telling stories that otherwise they wouldn't find. So that, you know, this discussion around tokenism in newsrooms, that's something that we talk about a lot as well. Is they will, if they see a story related to LGBT community or anything like that, they will send it over to me, my editors. But I don't see that as tokenism, like Sophie has to do this because she's gay. It's more that they just know that those are the stories I'm interested in, and I would tell it better perhaps than somebody else, or would be interested in looking into it. So I think it's a fine balance between kind of fostering those environments where people can explore the stories that matter to them, but not tokenizing it like you can only cover this stuff, or we're going to give it you just because. And I've never felt that at the Oxford Mail. I've certainly always felt it a very encouraging environment. And obviously I've covered plenty of stories that are things that are nothing to do with my identity. You know, I've covered lots of different things that as a normal journalist would cover. But when those stories are presented to me, that's something I'm interested in. So I've been very lucky in that sense, but I know certainly other people that are part of the LGBT journalism network have certainly found their newsrooms can be quite old-fashioned in the way in which stories are told, and the kinds of stories that are told, especially like if the publication is for a very small sort of rural community. I've heard of a lot of that. They might be, this person, a journalist, might be the only out LGBT person in their newsroom, and so sort of telling those stories is not something that's ever traditionally been done. So I know that other people have kind of encountered this a little bit of, I'm not going to call it pushback, but maybe a little bit friction to telling certain types of stories. But personally, I've always been very lucky, and the kind of attitude my editor's always taken with, if I've wanted to do a little bit of freelance work on the side that's to do with LGBT stuff, is that as long as it doesn't kind of cross over with something that the Oxford Mail would cover, then they have no problem with me pitching something to Gay Times or the Metro or anything like that, because it's something they wouldn't cover anyway. Of course, that doesn't go for every publication. I know some places have some very strict rules about, you work for us, you can't write for anywhere else. But because of that, it means that I have been able to explore more national stories during my time working as a local journalist. So I guess the takeaway for me is that I've had very positive experience, despite the newsroom being very white and, you know, quite traditionalist in that sense. But yeah, as I say, it's difficult because someone else could have a very different experience, and I know people have had very different experiences by what they've shared in the community group we have for the network. So again, it's something that's a work in progress, as you mentioned. It's definitely we're not there yet. We're not there at the kind of rainbow end of the of it, shall we say?
Yeah, you've spoken a lot about obviously being at the Oxford Mail and the positive experience you've had, and also when we spoke before, you were really keen to talk about the importance of local news. I know we've touched on it, like in relation to LGBTQ plus coverage, and like maybe I just thought we could talk about that a bit more, and why is that so important in your opinion, and maybe you could share any particular stories that you have had a greater impact on you, or like kind of stick in your mind that when you've been writing them in terms of that representation.
So local stories, I mean, I'm very passionate about local news, and I think that there's this connotation, I think, in journalism from our audiences, perhaps from people working in the industry itself, that LGBTQ plus stories are separate from local news. They're not local news, they're national issues, which of course they are, but certain things do impact local communities directly. If a pub closes that's an LGBT safe space and that closes down, that's going to impact that community directly. That matters to that group of people in the same way that if, say, a Sikh temple was closed down, it would impact the community. So I think it's really important to tell these stories. When you work in local journalism, you know, you're going to be telling stories every day that impact people who live on your patch. And so doing that authentically and efficiently is something that is really important. So as I said, there's this kind of connotation that the LGBTQ plus journalism is separate from local news, that it's national issues, that it's, you know, these decisions that are made in government about trans conversion therapy or you know, really homophobic bills put forward by senators in America. You know, it's not stuff that would happen at like little towns in the middle of Gloucestershire or something. And that's why it's really important to tell those stories and change those attitudes, that you know, those stories matter. And I think that's the really important thing, is often those stories have not been told. And it's really important that they are told. As I say, if a venue, a safe space, a community space closes down, that's going to have a direct impact on people who've used that venue, people who might use it in the future and now won't be able to. And that's why it's really important to tell those stories. I mean, for example, me working as a journalist, I've told some really important stories, you know, working the Oxford Mail. One that really horrific homophobic hate crime that happened in the Oxford city centre last year. And this man was whipped by a belt, the end of a belt. He was whipped and called, you know, a homophobic slur. And people were shocked in Oxford that would happen in the city centre. In, you know, we talk about Oxford as one of the most, you know, historic and cosmopolitan kind of cities in the country. You know, people come from all over the world to study at Oxford University. And then there's this really horrific homophobic hate crime that happened on the main street where there's loads of bars and people go out for a night out. And people were shocked by that. They couldn't believe it. But then you look at the statistics of hate crimes in Thames Valley, and it's not shocking if you compare it to those statistics. Hate crimes are still happening. They're actually rising. Hate crimes are rising. Homophobic and transphobic hate crimes. And that's something that needs to be told, because that's really important. Another story I'm working on at the moment is about wait times at the nearest gender identity clinic to Oxford, which is just over the border in Northamptonshire. But people are having to wait for a first appointment, 3.5 years for a first appointment for a gender identity clinic appointment. If that was any other type of clinic, any other part of the NHS, it would be a national scandal. And so those are the really important sort of stories that can be told locally. And, you know, if you work for a local newspaper and you're on this Zoom right now, those are things you can look into: hate crime statistics, gender identity clinic wait times. Reach out to your community, even just in community groups, and ask them, what are the issues you're facing? What are you worried about? How does this impact you? For example, you know, something happens in the national news, ask people, how does this impact you? And that's the sort of stories that are really important and should be told. And, you know, those voices matter. It's not just people in the upper echelons of government that their voices matter. Local people's voices matter. So again, that's very much a reason why I wanted to emphasise the importance of LGBT stories in local news through the work of the network, which we've seen a lot of that in the Facebook community group we have. People just share links to stories they've written about different things, and they'll say, oh, I'm just really proud of this, I just want to share it. And that's lovely to see people sharing that. Like, I don't know what you know, maybe a drag show that happened in Southampton means to that community, because I'm not from that area, but clearly it meant something, because it was really important, a well-received story. Clearly that mattered. So it's great to see those sort of stories being shared and people kind of connecting with each other through them. So yeah, that would be my kind of answer for that one, really.
Yeah, we've kind of, you know, you've kind of elaborated really well on how important it is to have not only good local journalism, but local journalism that's also, you know, connecting the two, rather than leaving LGBTQ issues as a national issue, and making sure that LGBTQ people can see themselves in their own communities. Obviously, you've expressed that you had quite a positive experience with the Oxford Mail, and that they kind of gave you the freedom to be able to report on issues you're passionate about, and kind of gave you that agency to kind of discover your own niche while also serving your community really well. How do you think, obviously, because this isn't the case across the industry, how do you think, even from publications down to journos like ourselves, how do we create kind of positive impact to try and, you know, create the attitudes that you've experienced and the way that you've served communities? How do we get that, you know, kind of consistently and create those positive impacts, I guess, and make sure we're serving our communities adequately?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. It's a difficult one, because it would vary depending on the sort of publication you work for. Obviously, local news is a different beast to working in trade magazines, or working for national news, or working in sports media. They obviously all connect, all have similar things, the way you tell stories, the way you get sources, but the audiences are different, their needs are different. So it's difficult to kind of make it a one size fits all sort of thing. Speaking directly from local news, I think obviously a lot of local newspapers and outlets nowadays are owned by one of just a few big massive conglomerates, which, if you work in a newsroom and you feel like not enough is being done to tell stories of a particular community, not just speaking about LGBT stuff, obviously this diversity workshop series is addressing lots of characteristics. Let's say that not enough is being done to cover disabled community or communities who are not white or other religious communities, then speak to your editor. I think that's the first point of call, is say, we're not doing enough about this. Maybe set up meetings with those community leaders. What can we do to help tell the stories of your community? This is the thing about, if you work in a majority white newsroom, which the Oxford Mail newsroom is majority white, sometimes we miss things that happen with the Muslim community or the Sikh community, just because the people who work, we're not part of that, so we don't realise these things are happening, and then you see it on Facebook afterwards and you're like, oh gosh, now I've kind of got to do the story in retrospect rather than being there when it happens. So I think no matter what kind of coverage is not being approached in the right way, I think the best thing to always do is just go out of your way to talk to those leaders, and those people will often appreciate it. They will often appreciate that you're taking the time to want to tell their story. So I think that's certainly one big step to do. And then another thing is obviously the culture within the newsroom itself. You can put forward changes in your newsroom to make things more inclusive. Speaking on LGBT topics, maybe you can talk to people in your newsroom about putting pronouns in their signature on their email to make your newsroom seen a little bit more inclusive of people who might not identify as cisgender, that kind of thing. I know, for example, like one thing I did at the Oxford Mail is that, because I was part of the staff committee for the region, so not just the Oxford Mail, but lots of the other publications, and it has like advertising and all the other departments in that. And I spoke about getting free sanitary products in all of the toilets, and my regional manager said, that's a great idea. We're going to do that now for all of the offices in my region. So now those are all available in all the toilets for whomever needs them, which of course is great for kind of gender inclusion and people not feeling awkward about having to ask for a product, because they know if they're having a little emergency, they can go and use that in whatever toilet they feel comfortable. So those are little things that you can do to kind of change the culture in the newsroom as well. And obviously engaging with your audience is another big thing, seeing how they react to different stories you tell. Why do they react in that way? And kind of addressing their concerns. Maybe people are really outraged that maybe there's a trans community centre being opened up. Why do they feel like that? Trying to, address their concerns by mitigating it, explaining, maybe all the kind of inverted commas fake news you might see is not the case, and actually engage with the audience rather than speaking at them. Make it a conversation, and that way kind of stories again can be shared wider. People can appreciate them more, they can understand and learn from it, rather than just feel like they're being talked to by people who kind of sit in this upper echelon telling them what the news is. I think that's kind of, it's difficult, as I say, it's not like a one size fits all thing, because it really depends on the audience. Like, as I said, the needs of people who are interested in reading about the football are very different to the needs of people who might read the Swindon Advertiser. It's all different, but there's some things, you can definitely do. So engaging with the community itself, engaging with your audience, and changing the newsroom culture. Of course, all of these things can't be done overnight. I know it's a lot to ask individual journalists to go out and try and change the world, but if we all just try and do a little bit of something, then we can hopefully make the media landscape a little bit more inclusive, make our workplaces more inclusive, which in itself makes journalists feel more included, feel like their workplace is a happier place, which in itself will help productivity. Not to turn it into like a business spiel, but it always has this kind of circular impact. So there's lots of different things to do, lots of ways we can address things, but those are certainly some things that come to mind that can be done to help make the newsroom change for the future, I think.
Yeah, well, you've obviously done so many positive things, but you clearly work quite closely with the NCCJ and even doing with the Oxford Mail and being on the board and stuff. And obviously, most notably, your founding of the LGBTQ plus journalism network. I think we can't do the talk if we don't talk about it. It'd be great if you could kind of just talk us through kind of the journey from start to where you are now. And I know I saw on your Instagram that you're doing you've kind of partnered with Queer AF to run a joint content series called Journalists Like Me and sharing stories and advice from LGBT plus journos. So yeah, it would be great if you could kind of take us through that. And
Yeah, what I'm just going to do is drop a link in the chat to the website, just in case anybody's interested. There's a way you can join the Facebook group in there, and it's got information about what the different things we're doing are. So the network was quite literally founded because I was really annoyed that a community didn't exist in 2022 for LGBTQ plus journalists. So one dark night in January of this year, I was looking on the internet at different groups like We Are Black Journos and Women in Journalism, and I was like, wow, these look really interesting. I want to join something for LGBT journalists too. Googled it, and the only thing I could find was a union for LGBT journalists that specifically work in Washington, DC, specifically in the US, or there's obviously a couple of things like Intermedia UK and sports media, LGBT sports media, which of course are very specific organizations, but they weren't so much community spaces. And I was a bit like, wow, I can't believe that there's not something like this in 2022. And I was really annoyed about it. And then that anger kind of turned to determination, 30 minutes on Canva, made a Facebook group, popped it on Twitter, and then it sort of just ran away from me, really. We had 100 members within a week. And so it clearly showed that there was a need and an interest for a space where people can just come together. Obviously, the work of these other organisations is brilliant, and they do some really brilliant things across the media. But I think there was a gap for a community space. So the Facebook group now has more than 200 members. People share links to their stories they're really proud of. They will share opportunities and job opportunities in their gigs. They might ask for people to send them pitches for freelance stuff. Look for sources if they're looking to write a story, let's say on the trans community, and they're trying to find people to speak with. They ask in there and people get back to them. And this is kind of really nice engagement that happens in the community space. And then as well as that, yes, we have partnered with Queer AF, which is another queer media organisation that's attempting to kind of change the industry, change the way in which LGBT stories are told. We've run a joint content series called Journalists Like Me, which is about LGBTQ plus journalists' experiences of working in the media. We've told some really great stories. One story, for example, was about a Muslim journalist who isn't out to her family as a lesbian. So she's won lots of awards for her journalism work, but her family have absolutely no idea because she writes under a pseudonym. And it was really incredible for her to write for us about that. She talked about how her headscarf is a bit like a superhero cape because nobody knows her identity, it's secret. And it was really incredible piece, I will say. And then we had someone else write about being trans and not having English as a first language while working in the UK media industry. Another person about how working at an LGBT inclusive newsroom actually helped them with their alcoholism because they relapsed, and they felt like working in that space, they actually were given the support they needed because people understood these kind of intersections between mental health issues, addiction, and your identity. So a lot of really great stories being told. And obviously we've done great projects like, for example, like workshop talks and panel events and things like we're doing here right now. So it's definitely a growing thing, but I have a lot of things that I want to do with it. But it's kind of me as a one-man band and then a couple of very lovely volunteers who help me out on the side. So if I could get some funding, if anyone has a very rich parent who just wants to give away money, but if I had funding, it would be great to do a lot more things. But yeah, no, I'm really proud of where it's at the moment. And as I say, I've got some big goals for it, 2023. So watch this space.
In terms of watching this space, can you tell us a bit about the goals or any future ideas if you were to get the funding, like the kind of direction you want the network to head in? I know it's a community space, but I feel like expanding upon that is probably going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm working with someone to try and get a podcast set up, but that's a little bit of a slow process, just trying to get all the bits working with that. But that's something I definitely want to try and get going. Working title is The Queer Newsroom, and talk about LGBT journalism issues, interview people, working journalists, kind of, it'll just be like a nice advice sort of podcast for people who want to get into journalism, perhaps specialise in that area. And then I'm working on another content series, which you hope to be an interview series with people. Again, very early stages of that working. So there's a couple of things on the back burner, but of course I'm always open to ideas. If anybody ever wants to come to me with, you know, if they want to sort of work on a project, always get in touch, drop me a line, because I'm very open to, you know, I don't see it as like my project, my thing that I like to control like a puppet master. For me, I created it for the community. So if people want to come to me with ideas, I'm very open to working on things with people, doing joint projects if people are doing other things, because I see it as something not just like my little toy. It's something for everybody. So yeah, it's hopefully 2023 will be a big year.
Definitely, that sounds so exciting. To be honest, as somebody who's LGBTQ, I found the network really, really helpful, and the workshops and stuff. I think it definitely has been a big impact in the community, especially the journalism space. This might be a bit of a personal question, but obviously I'm a trainee LGBTQ journalist at the minute. What advice would you have for people who are aspiring, who are training and coming into this industry, navigating it, who want to make an impact? What would be your like quintessential advice into coming into this industry?
My big thing is say yes to everything and take every opportunity you can. Obviously, I say that with an understanding that, as we discussed, a lot of people in journalism come from very privileged backgrounds. They can afford to do unpaid internships and work placements in London, and a lot of people can't, and I understand that. So what I say is take every opportunity you can, not every single opportunity that comes to you, but every one you can do. Obviously, you don't, if you have trouble with, for example, getting to a big city to do a work placement, find out if there's remote options. Can you do a work placement remotely? Can you offer to send freelance pieces to your local paper if they aren't taking workplace on? Get involved in your student newspaper, your student blog. Maybe you have a really niche interest that you feel like isn't being covered locally or nationally. For example, let's say you're really into your local grassroots football team. Maybe ask them, can I come on? Can I do some social media stuff? Or just start a blog, start a WordPress, which you can do for free, and just write about that. Maybe you're really interested in farming and agriculture, and you have a really niche interest in like the impact of the cost of living crisis on farmers and stuff. Maybe you come from a rural community. Start a blog about that, write about that, you know, send freelance pieces out. The wonderful thing about the way the industry is at the moment is that with the internet, you can make your own stamp on the industry yourself. You don't need to go and work at the Telegraph for 6 months to do that. You know, and if you're not a writer, start a TikTok. Maybe do a TikTok about your local grassroots football team. You love going to their matches. Film them, you know, scoring goals, and do interviews with the players, and maybe like history things about them and all that sort of thing. Like whatever your niche is, whatever your bag is, there's ways of showing that off as a trainee. Of course, the traditional routes are always student journalism, going and doing work placements, internships, that sort of thing. But obviously with that in mind that some people can't afford to do that, there's lots and lots and lots of other ways you can get your name out there and create a presence for yourself, which then when you apply for jobs, employers want to see that you have a bit of go in you, that, you know, you didn't just go to uni, do your journalism course, do the bare minimum, or whatever course you did, do the bare minimum and just apply for a job and hope you'll get a job. You know, if you work full time and you want to try and get into journalism, use that to your advantage. You know, maybe you could, let's say you work in the retail industry full time, but you're trying to get into journalism. Maybe you can write stuff about the sector you work in and use that as kind of a vehicle to create a presence for yourself. I know it's hard. And this is the issue with kind of saying to people, try and do as much as you can, because a lot of the time it has to be free. And I know that's really difficult. Like, I did so much unpaid work, so much, I'd go to work, I'd go and do my NCTJ course, and then I'd like work, and I'd do freelance things, and I wouldn't have any time for myself. And I don't recommend doing that because it's really difficult. But that's what I mean when I say that those traditional routes, if they aren't viable for you financially, there's lots of other ways you can do things. As I say, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter. Maybe you're really into local government and you just like to go along to the council meetings. Just live tweet them. Live tweet your local council meetings. And you can show that off if you apply for an apprenticeship position at a local paper or something like that. You can show that off. Be like, look, I can live tweet. Because that's a really valuable skill in journalism, is being able to live blog, live tweet, do tweet threads, engage your audience in that way using social media. So yeah, you don't have to do experience in the traditional way. Again, coming back to that grassroots football example, you could live tweet those. There's lots of different ways that you can get experience and show off your skills. So it's difficult, because I say take every opportunity, but appreciate that isn't always the best option for everybody. So take every opportunity you can, but bearing in mind that you've got to put yourself first and your mental health, and trying to take everything and do everything is not always viable for people. So yeah, it's I feel like that was a bit of a wishy-washy answer.
No, it definitely wasn't. I think, it definitely is a balancing act.
Yeah.
Because when you first come in, you're trying to do a bit of everything.
Mm.
Kind of like you touched a bit on non-traditional routes into journalism and looking into that. If people can't afford to say, go, I think in Wales most local anti-CJ centre, not unfortunately, because I love studying at Cardiff, but it's Cardiff, and that's not really financially viable, especially for a lot of young working class people who want to be journalists. What kind of routes would you recommend for them if the anti-CJ or a more traditional journalism course isn't something that's accessible for them?
Yeah, so this is the wonderful thing again about journalism, is there are so many routes into it. You don't have to go to university. If you want to go to university because you want to get the university experience, or you want to move to another part of the country, great, brilliant. You can do a fast track course, which takes 6 months. Issue is they're in London and Manchester, which again, if you, for example, maybe come from a rural ex-mining community in North Wales or something, appreciate that might not be viable for you. You can also apply to do apprenticeships, which of course are paid on the job 2-year courses, which as part of that, you get your NCTJ training at the same time and you earn a salary. So if going to university or doing a course without being able to work at the same time is not an option, you can do that, which is a really accessible way, I think, of getting into journalism. And you get the on-the-job training, which then from that you can then use that as a bounce off to then get a full-time position, or then go and start your seniors training, or it's a good way of bouncing onto it. Again, as well, there's also the Journalism Diversity Fund, which is an amazing fund. It's what helped me do my NCTJ training during the pandemic when jobs were very scarce, and that's something that you can apply for. And I think an important thing to point out about the NCTJ funding is that they will fund your NCTJ training. They will also give you extra money, for example, if you need travel costs. So let's say, for example, using the Wales example, you don't live in Cardiff, but the course is in Cardiff, and you need to commute. If you say to them, right, a train ticket might cost me X amount for a month to get back and forth, they would pay for that, so that's not a cost you have to endure, so you can at least get to your course. They gave me living costs. They gave me £200 a month, which obviously is not a lot, but it was just enough to kind of cover food and that sort of thing during my NCTJ training as well. And another important thing to say about the JDF is that what they consider diverse isn't just, if you're not white or you're trans or you're disabled. Obviously they do give out funding for that, but maybe you come from a background where you grew up in foster care, or maybe you're a single mother who has decided that you want to become a journalist. Maybe your parents didn't speak English when they moved to the UK and you actually had to help continue to teach them English as you grow up. All of those things are factors that could help get you Journalism Diversity funding. It's a very broad scope in what they consider diverse, and generally what they mean by that is those experiences that have often been disincluded from this very white, male hegemonic, middle class industry. So if you have those experiences and you want to, you know, bring attention to certain parts of society, even using the Wales example again, maybe you come from a working class ex-mining community, maybe your entire community were always miners, and now there's kind of not a lot of employment in that particular little town. That could be something that you can raise with the NCTJ when you apply for the funding. You know, you want to raise awareness of these rural communities impacted by, you know, sort of mine closures and you know, the long-term impacts this has on these areas. And you have that lived experience because you grew up there. So basically their definition of diversity is a very, very wide and broad one. That can be a great vehicle as well for being able to complete your training if you're in a position where you can't just not work at the same time or not have any financial backing. So there's a lot of different ways of getting into journalism, and I think publications need to shout more about their apprenticeships. They need to make people aware that that is an option, because it is a great option, and it's a way of getting people into the industry who otherwise just wouldn't be able to afford to do it. And those are the voices we need. Those are the ones we need.
Definitely. And I think if, you know, anybody's thinking about applying to the JDF that's watching, 100% do it, because I thought I was probably didn't have enough experience journalism wise to apply for it, but just definitely do it, take the leap. I'm going to ask you one more question, then kind of open the floor, but this is more in terms of freelancing and doing journalism work as an LGBTQ journalist. How do you avoid obviously kind of getting, especially in freelancing sense, getting pigeonholed into people just commissioning you for you know, LGBTQ issues? Because obviously you've balanced that really well in terms of having a wide scope of different writing. How did you balance that?
Yeah, so the majority of my writing comes from obviously working at the Oxford Mail, being a normal, inverted commas, journalist there. So of course I've written a lot about transport issues, crime, politics, local government, you know, social issues, etc., etc. When I've freelanced, that's been more when I've pitched more LGBT related content, and obviously that's less common because I work full time. So usually when I pitch stories, it's stories I want to tell. So for example, I did a piece for the Metro about taking my parents to their very first Pride. I took them to London Pride and did a feature about that, and that was a story I wanted to tell. So I approached them for it. No one's kind of, I hate to say, no one's ever said, oh, I'll pay you 200 quid to do this. Unfortunately, no one just sends those emails to me. But the stories that I've pitched, for example, like, you know, the ones that have been in Gay Times or Pink News prior to, you know, landing this job with them, have been things that I've wanted to write. So that's kind of, perhaps because I don't work as a freelancer full time, I think it's different for people who work as freelancers. They might have a different experience of people being like, oh, you're well known for writing about XYZ, can you write that for us? And then that's where the pigeonholing can start. But I think a big thing is as well, when you get your edits back, when you pitch a story, when you write it for them, when you get the edits back, remember that this is your story, it's your voice, because a lot of publications will try and change things here and there. And if it's not authentic to you, you need to raise that. And that's how you can stop kind of that voice not being yours and becoming inauthentic. So as I said, I've been quite lucky in the position of being a full-time journalist at a particular publication. So whenever I've done freelancing, it's been on my terms, but I can appreciate that other people do have that risk of being pigeonholed. And if someone's literally offering you money, there's that kind of incentive that you're like, oh, I need to just take the gig because I've got to pay rent, I've got to buy food, you know, that kind of thing. So it's a tricky one. It's very tricky. But I think a big thing is when you pitch stories, remember it's your story, you're pitching it. It's your voice, and, you know, remembering that when the edits come back.
I feel like that's a very, very good piece of advice that everybody could take on board, is remembering that it's your narrative and your story. Because I could talk your ear off and ask you questions for an hour, Sophie, and I don't want to be selfish. So I'm going to open the floor for the next few minutes for anyone who perhaps would like to kind of pick your brain a bit, because obviously you have a wealth of knowledge. So yeah, give anybody, if they want to ask some questions, they can raise some hands. If not, I'll keep talking your ear off, because I could talk your ear off for another hour.
Yeah, I'm easy on.
I actually have a question, because obviously you're going to pick news now, which is very exciting. Oh, Manvi has a question, actually. Go for it. Mine is not as important.
Sorry. Hi, thank you for speaking. This talk's been so interesting, and it's really helpful to see that representation as a member of the LGBTQ community. I'm doing an article at the moment. I'm a student journalist about Qatar and how the World Cup is being held there. There's a lot of backlash, queer football fans feeling betrayed. I was just wondering if I could ask you a few questions and possibly include it in the article I'm writing, but it's not going to be published or anything.
Yeah, go on.
Is that all right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. So you spoke a lot about how local LGBTQ stories there needs to be more coverage because there's a real lack at the moment, and how international stories kind of take that space. Do you have any thoughts about how this issue is being reported at the moment, and how to not sensationalize, or any thoughts about how to platform queer voices in the right way? Because I've seen a few BBC articles where they're asking people like Qatari people, how they feel about the issue. If just any thoughts you have about the process and how to cover international stories regarding the LGBT community and specifically Qatar, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I mean, with the World Cup, of course, it's something that happens. It's a global event at the end of the day, so it impacts every country and community because everywhere in the country is showing it on pub screens. Even if you don't watch the World Cup, you're not interested in it. People are, pubs are advertising watch events and stuff for it. So it's certainly something that's in the community. And in terms of the LGBT issues, so I think a big thing for local journalists and local news outlets is, of course, trying to localize the story. For example, I work for the Oxford Mail, did an Oxford person go to the World Cup and what was it like? Trying to find those kind of voices, which I think a big thing is that if you've got a local pride group on patch, ask them what they think of the World Cup. Are they supporting it? Are they not? Do you have any local LGBT pubs or bars that are showing the matches or not? For example, like GAY in London has said that they are not showing it. They are absolutely, not supporting it. And are other venues locally doing that? I mean, I saw that Wales Online, I don't know if anyone saw on the news about that Welsh football fan who had their rainbow bucket hat taken off of them, or they weren't allowed in the stadium because they were wearing it. Wales Online actually changed its logo to have a little rainbow bucket hat on the corner of the logo. And that was a very small thing, but I thought that was a really brilliant way of kind of showing their support for the community and for the football fans from Wales who'd gone over there to watch the match. So that was obviously a very, very small thing that they did. But it's quite a tricky question because obviously the stories of the way in which you would cover Qatar, it varies depending on, if you work for local news or national news. If you work for local news, it's always trying to localize the story. Has any of, the fans from your patch been arrested for wearing a rainbow flag? Have people gone over there and had an awful experience or a great experience? This is, what local journalists will be trying to find out. And then obviously the national perspective is much more wider, kind of on the human rights abuses that are happening directly. So it's quite a complicated topic, and obviously it is easy to sensationalize these sort of stories, like for example with the bucket hat thing, kind of go, I'm sure some publications went in on the angle that man wears banned item and is shocked that he's banned from the stadium, but at the end of the day it's a hat. So I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question or if that's just a very long.
No, that is really helpful. I'm definitely going to look into talking to someone from GAY, because that's really interesting. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. Yeah.
And there's quite a few as well, if you want to Google it. There's quite a few LGBT football like societies and associations that have actually got a couple of campaigns to do with the World Cup. I think the group that runs the Rainbow Laces campaign has something at the moment about the World Cup, so they might be worth approaching for a comment or some information about that as well.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Yeah, that was really I've been thinking a lot about Qatar at the moment as well. I'm a big football fan, and it's very conflicting.
Yeah,
very
same. I love the
feelings.
football.
Yeah, massive football fan. But yeah, we're coming to the end now. We've got a few minutes. I was just gonna, if no one else has any questions, I was just gonna say, if you wanted to literally briefly, talk about your move to Pink News, especially coming from Oxford Mail, it's just you're obviously going into your specialism a bit more. It's exciting, and how you feel about that, and why you chose to make that move to a more kind of specialist publication.
Yeah, I mean, so the big thing with this move is it's quite bittersweet, really, because I wasn't looking for a new job at all. Very happy at the Oxford Mail, really enjoying my role, love the patch, love the audience, that sort of thing. But when I saw this job come up, I thought, well, I've got to apply for it. It's exactly what I want to do, news reporter at Pink News. It's exactly the kind of remit I want to work in, and I'd be silly not to apply, because I might not apply and then they might not hire for that same role for like another 2 years. So I just applied. I didn't hear anything for a couple of months, and then I had 2 interviews and then got offered the job last week, which, as I say, is quite bittersweet, because I'm not leaving the Oxford Mail because I, say the workplace culture is toxic or my editors are, I don't want to swear, not a very nice person. That's not true at all. It's a great environment. So it's quite bittersweet, but it's definitely an exciting move, because I'm going to be covering national, international LGBT content. There's going to be obviously they have a massive audience in America, so there'll be a lot of covering homophobic and transphobic bills that are being put through in different states, like, for example, the anti-drag bills that are being put through to make drag performance illegal in certain states and things like that. So there's going to be a lot of coverage around that sort of stuff. I've sent a lot of freedom of information requests off since I got offered the job, because I know they'll all come in before I start, so I can just take loads of data sets for different things in to do stories. And yeah, it's an exciting move, and definitely looking forward to starting, but it'll be a bit of a change, because obviously with local news you have a specific patch, whereas this is such a wide-ranging remit that it'll just be a bit of a change moving to there. But I'm very excited for it, very, very excited. Yeah,
congratulations again. I think we spoke about so much. It was so interesting. But yeah, it's coming up to 7 now. Thank you so much for coming. Honestly, it's been amazing. Some great advice and some great questions as well. That's it, I think. I'll send everyone the recording, and thank you to everyone else that came as well. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
I'm sure Shannon has.
Thank you so much, Sophie. It's honestly been such a pleasure to have you and hear all of the great advice and stuff and knowledge you're able to kind of bestow on us. It's been really great having a chat with you. And
thank you for asking me. It's been lovely, obviously, talk about this stuff, and hopefully some of my long rambles might have helped someone somewhere. But of course, if anyone in this call or anyone who watches this recording afterwards has any questions, you can just go to the LGBTQ Journalism Network website. You can join our Facebook. If anyone has any questions for me, you can always drop me a line. Or if you want to work with me on any projects, just let me know. But yeah, it's been brilliant, and I do hope that something I said is helpful somewhere.
Yeah, definitely.
No, definitely
it's all been really helpful. I think everyone would agree. It's been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.